And you know I can talk forever, so you have to tell me if there's any particular dimension you're interested in.
I actually only have the few questions for and we didn't actually specifically talk about the parts for the Islamophobia, just in general, the general cause of the Islamophobia.
Okay, even though I no longer live in the United States, and I haven't lived there in about 12 years,
Yes.
My experience in the U.S. is that it dates back way before 9/11, okay? I remember when I first started in graduate school, I studied Arabic and Chinese. And even in the classical Arabic class and the modern Arabic class, but even in the classical Arabic class, the students were very hostile to Arabs, to Islam. And it was for me, it was such a contrast between, I also did, classical Chinese. I mean, people who studied about China, did it because they were really interested and respected the history and the culture. And then I would be in my Arabic or Islamic history courses. And the students in those classes, they had very little respect and sometimes, pretty blatant prejudice and sometimes even racism towards Muslims and Arabs. And so, in graduate school, this is back in 1985, you see that people have very different attitudes towards things they don't know. People study about China because they don't know anything about it, but they're interested in it. And people studied about Islam, my experience back then, because they were scared. And at one point I even asked my professor, this is in the classical Arabic course, he's an older German professor, I basically said, what is wrong with these people? Because I was so upset. I couldn't figure out why they were so hostile. I mean, they were taking a very difficult classical Arabic course, and yet you could tell they were so hostile towards, Muslims and Arabs. So, in that sense, I mean, I know that now, today, Islamophobia is an obvious, huge problem in the United States. But from my point of view, this is a problem which has been around for a while. And in fact, immediately after 9/11, I was teaching at Stanford then, there was all of a sudden a pretty significant, I was teaching courses on Islam, a pretty significant rise in students interested in courses on Islam. So all the courses related to Islam, the enrollment increased. And at least you had a sense that Americans, and probably a higher percentage of more educated Americans, realized, maybe there's something we don't know. Maybe there's something we misunderstood. Maybe we need to educate ourselves more about the situation in the Middle East. But the depressing thing is that sort of increased awareness of the importance of learning more about Islam and the Middle East. That didn't last that long, because already by the fall of 2002, when it was pretty clear we were going to invade Iraq, then there was a decrease in the students' interest in taking courses to do with Islam. And I felt, or I sensed, that for Americans, they're like, if we're going to go and invade and destroy, a country in this part of the world, maybe it's better not to know so much about it. In other words, so the one inclination or trend that existed in the United States to really seriously try to find out more about Islam, it didn't last very long at all. Today, recently, to my mind, the only significant effort I've seen was only announced about a week ago. It's called the Bridge Initiative, and Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. has obviously just spent a lot of time and effort researching what is the best way to deal with Islamophobia. And so what they've done is they've set up a website. It literally just started about a week ago. But the idea is, part of the problem is, if you're in the United States, you can get good information about the Middle East and Middle Eastern politics, American foreign policy, that's very critical. You can get that information, but you have to make some effort. Without any effort whatsoever, you are being bombarded with biased information or out and out false information. Just, you know, both directly and indirectly. Obviously, if you watch Fox News for more than a few minutes, you'll see their bias. But I think that's what concerns me the most. And to be honest, it's one of the reasons I left the United States. I just got so tired of it. Like, I remember I used to teach a course on women in Islam at Stanford. And the very first day of class, I would ask them, okay, when you think about Muslim women, what image comes to mind, or what images come to mind? And they have to write an essay. And so they write an essay for like, 20 minutes or something. And of course, and I say, listen, just talk honestly about, basically the stereotypes. And it's all about oppressed, faceless, no control, abused, yada, 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 yada. And I'll never forget, these Stanford students are really, really good students. I mean, they really are incredible students. But I remember I had two students who, they started off their essay that way, and they both stopped. They said, wait a minute. And one said, she was a work study student at the university, and one of the people she worked with was a Muslim student. I can't remember if she was from Somalia or the Sudan. I think she was from the Sudan. She's like, wait a minute, I know a Muslim woman. She's not oppressed. She's not uneducated. She's smart and independent and here on her own and really accomplished and da-da-da. It's like, and so then she's writing very honestly, self-critically, like, wow. Here I have the only Muslim woman I know goes against all of the stereotypes that I've been socialized with. And yet when you ask me to write this, instead of giving you my own actual experience with a Muslim woman, I automatically find myself just repeating, superficial stereotypes. And like I said, so these Stanford students are smart, and they realized, talking about cognitive dissonance, right? They realize as they're writing, like, oh my God. Because if somebody had asked them, if I ask you about, some, X, and you actually had an experience of X, would you instead give me, like, the public view about X? They would say, of course not. Like, I'm a smart, critically thinking person. But in fact, and another student wrote the exact same thing. She's writing along about all the stereotypes. She said, wait a minute. I know a Muslim woman. She had a friend in high school. I think she was from Texas, who was Muslim. And this young woman was like outrageous and outspoken and really smart and independent and kind of crazy and wild. And so she did the exact same thing as she's writing. She's like, wait a minute. Here I am writing all these stereotypes. And yet I know a Muslim, woman, a young woman from my high school. And she wasn't anything like these stereotypes. So why am I writing these stereotypes? But the point of the story is that, and I very much felt this when I was teaching in California, is that in the U.S. it's like layers and layers. I mean, the stereotypes, there's so many layers. And I remember, like, by the end of a semester, of some pretty intense teaching, I felt like I had maybe unveiled, again the word veil, but anyway, I'd taken off maybe 10 or 20 layers of prejudice, which is a lot of exhausting work. But then I felt like there was still 20 more. I mean, people fear the unknown. People fear the other. But for example, here, when I moved here in the Gulf, people in the Gulf, especially after seeing Iraq destroyed, right? People in the Gulf have good reason to be worried about the United States. And when I first got here, I had students who were clearly very anti-American, very critical of, Westerners in general, Americans in particular, maybe not so, obviously many of them were very, very anti-Semitic, much more so than any Arabs I know my age. But with the prejudices I've had to deal with my students here, and it's been a lot because I've been here now for 12 years, there are a few layers of prejudice, right, and stereotype, but it's not that difficult. I mean, it's like, to my mind, it's like 2 or 3 layers. And then, I have students who started my class, making just gross generalizations about, not even halfway through the semester, they're no longer doing that. So my own experience has been, that yes, people of different cultures have stereotypes about the other. But in the US, I'm sure, to my mind, it's actually much, much worse in Europe, but even in the US, it's coming from so many different directions. It's coming from, obviously, television shows and movies and popular culture, and that's what's, to my mind, so disturbing, is that in the US, it just comes from so many different directions, and people they're so unself-consciously prejudiced. Here, there is prejudice, but to my mind, it's so much more superficial, and it's so much easier to deal with. There's a famous film. It's a musical. It's from anyway, it's called Fiddler on the Roof. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's like this 3-hour film, and it's a musical. It's all like, songs. And it's about a Jewish peasant dairy farmer in Russia, like around 1900. So he's got dairy cows, then he's got a wife, he's got 5 daughters. And so the whole movie is about how he's going to marry off his 5 daughters and the problems that he faces. And my students in my sections, I used to teach like global studies, they had no problem with this film. They loved it. They found the characters completely, sympathetic. Nobody in my class said, "Oh my God, this is about Jews. I'm not going to watch this." I mean, nothing at all. So people have this idea that somehow, Arabs are so much more prejudiced, but to my mind, it's not the case. But anyway, so going back to the problem of Islamophobia in the States, I think it is a matter of education. And what I like about this Georgetown initiative, called the Bridge Institute, is it's trying to make available on the internet easy access to really good information and articles to educate people. Like right now, obviously, if you're an educated person, it's easy. If you want to find good articles, you can, but it's not as easy. It's easier to find the misinformation. Whereas this initiative is trying to make good information readily available. So you could then, if people ask you, you can say, here, just read this article. And also, it documented the fact that at this point in time, Islamophobia is like, it's a big business. I mean, that Pam Gellner woman, I mean, it's like, she's making, she has some, I think it's called, Democratic, I can't remember what it's called, but, their contributions have increased, I don't know, like 1,000-fold or something. I mean, or 3,000-fold. I mean, it's sort of like a monster that's been created, and it is able to tap into American fears in the worst possible way. And to be honest, I mean, was it the day before yesterday? 41 Ismailis or 43 Ismailis on a bus in Pakistan going to a community center were all massacred. 6 gunmen got onto the bus and killed them all. And given the sectarian differences that are happening now in this region, it just seems like if Muslims are killing other Muslims for no apparent reason, I mean, it's hard to convince Americans that, this is something, I don't know. It just seems like at this moment in time, there are so many things happening in the Muslim world between Muslims themselves. It's not helping at all.
Do you think that's
are there any?
Do you have any suggestions for this topic?
Well, I think what this initiative that Georgetown is doing, I think that is the best approach, to try and have one place where people know they can go and get good information on Islam, plus information that is basically documenting how this Islamophobia, it's called the Islamophobia industry right now in the United States, what it's doing and what it's up to, and how it's making things worse. But the other, to my mind, this goes back, I'm not sure when this started, but to my mind, one of the biggest problems is it happens with Muslims and it happens with African Americans. If there is a crazy person, let's say, who goes into a school and kills a bunch of people, if it's a white man, it's like, oh, that crazy person. If it's a black man, it's like, oh, that black person, right?
Yeah.
They automatically, of course, it's of a Muslim, then he becomes a Muslim terrorist. So if a white guy does it, it's just one crazy white person, like just like not connected to any ethnicity or identity. If it's a black person, well then it's definitely like, oh my God, you know, like his being black has something to do with it. And then if it's somebody who's Muslim, not only does his religion all of a sudden, you know, part of the thing, part of the headline, which is never the headline with the white person. I mean, when I say never, I mean it, because I have never actually seen that. You know, white Christian terrorist, I've just not seen that headline ever. And as long as you have these sort of instinctual responses, every time a Muslim does something bad, somehow it reflects on all Muslims, like to this day, you know. I mean, there's this constant thing like, why aren't more moderate Muslims speaking out against what these extremists do? Muslim moderates are constantly speaking out of what these extremists do. And they get stuck into this trap. Like if every time a crazy white person did something in the U.S. and you expected all white people, right? Would you expect all white people to like say, oh my God, you know, this white person was crazy, he doesn't reflect us? Of course you would. Every time a crazy Christian is, you would never expect all Christians. So it's sort of like this trap that Muslims have fallen into, and yet seriously, on an almost daily basis, you know, some person of some authority in the U.S. says, my God, why aren't more moderate Muslims speaking out against this? If this really isn't Islam, why aren't more moderate Muslims speaking out against this?
Do you think there's the solutions for this kind of stereotype?
I think it'll have to be through education, and I you know, it seems sort of like forced and artificial, but I do wish that, you know, American television shows would have more sympathetic Arab and Muslim characters, and there've been a few attempts, but not nearly enough to my mind. But I also think like now, like I said, it seems like you're forcing it, but in fact, you know, this happened. This had to happen gradually. Initially, you know, American television was mostly white, and they would have, you know, African American, you know, black characters. But then even only recently, even with a huge Hispanic population, it's only recently you see major popular shows that focus on, you know, Mexican American or Hispanic characters. But to my mind, it has to do with education. It has to do with more diverse views of Arabs and Muslims in popular culture.
I think it's good.
Okay.
Yes.
So you're gonna have a